You were so close. You could feel it. The momentum was real. The relationship was healthy. The opportunity was genuine. The version of yourself you had always wanted to become. It was right there. Not theoretical, actual. And then you ruined it. Maybe not dramatically. Maybe not in one clean moment. Maybe it was the drinking the night before the thing that mattered. The fight you picked for no reason you can explain. The email you never sent. The slow, invisible retreat from the room where your own life was finally starting to work. And afterward, the familiar voice. Why do you always do this? What is wrong with you? But here's what that voice gets wrong. It assumes the problem is weakness. It assumes failure of willpower. It assumes that some part of you simply could not perform. It is asking the wrong question entirely. Because what happened was not a failure of strength. What happened was a success. A perfect, precise, ferociously loyal success on behalf of something inside you that had one mission: to keep you exactly where it believed you belonged. This is not a story about motivation. This is not about discipline or mindset or the habits of high-performing people. This is a story about the oldest, quietest, most powerful force in your psychology, and why it will sacrifice everything you consciously want in order to preserve something you never consciously chose. The brain is not primarily a thinking machine. That is the misunderstanding almost everything gets wrong. We treat the mind as though it is a rational instrument, one that wants what we tell it to want, moves where we tell it to move, and fails only when we lack the resolve to push it properly. The entire architecture of modern self-help is built on this premise. Want it badly enough. Work hard enough. Believe hard enough. But the brain is not primarily a thinking machine. It is a prediction machine. A pattern recognition engine whose oldest, deepest function, the one that runs far beneath language, beneath conscious intention, beneath everything you call you, is not to find happiness. It is to confirm what it already knows. Neuroscientists call it predictive processing. The brain is constantly generating models of what the world is and what the self is. And it is constantly filtering incoming experience through those models, not neutrally, not with curiosity, with a powerful bias toward confirmation. Because consistency is safe. Because the known, even when painful, is metabolically cheaper than the unknown. The brain would rather be right than feel good. It would rather maintain its model of reality than update it, even when the update would serve you. This is not a flaw. It was never a flaw. In an environment where threats were physical and immediate, the capacity to recognize patterns instantly, to move through a familiar world without the cognitive cost of constantly relearning it, was survival. The brain that hesitated to confirm its own model did not survive long enough to question it. But we no longer live in that environment. And the machinery that once kept our ancestors alive now keeps many of us locked. Carl Jung understood something about this that clinical psychology would spend the better part of a century slowly rediscovering. He called it the shadow, not the dramatic villain of popular imagination, but the repository of everything the psyche has decided it cannot integrate. Everything that felt too threatening, too contradictory, too incompatible with the story we built of ourselves. The shadow is not darkness in the moral sense. It is simply what was pushed underground. And what is pushed underground does not disappear. It operates. Quietly, systematically, with enormous persistence, redirecting your behavior from beneath the threshold of your awareness. Jung also described a process he called enantiodromia, the tendency of the psyche to swing toward its opposite when pushed too far in one direction. You build momentum. You push hard toward the life you say you want, and then, mysteriously, something shifts. The momentum breaks, not from outside, from within. A decision that makes no rational sense. a pattern that returns like weather. You did not arrive here as a blank page. Every child arrives with enormous plasticity, neurologically, emotionally, psychologically. And then experience begins to write. Not in a single dramatic moment, usually in accumulation, in repetition, in the slow, quiet architecture of thousands of ordinary days. The child who grows up in a house where love is conditional learns something, not as a conscious philosophy. As a nervous system fact, love requires performance. Safety requires compliance. To need too much, to want too much, to be too much, that is dangerous. So the child adapts. They build a self that fits the available environment. A self that is smaller than what they actually are. A self designed not for flourishing but for survival within that specific ecosystem. The psychologist Donald Winnicott made a distinction that is worth sitting with. He separated what he called the true self, the spontaneous, alive, authentic core of a person, from the false self, the adaptive structure built in response to external demand. The false self is not dishonest in the way a lie is dishonest. It is sincere in its own terms. It genuinely functions. But it functions in the service of safety, not aliveness. And over time, the false self can become so well established that the person wearing it forgets they built it. They mistake it for who they are. The contemporary world has not created this pattern, but it has done something particular to it. It has pressurized it in a way no previous era could have managed. Social media did not invent comparison. Comparison is ancient. What social media did was industrialize it, accelerate it, and make it inescapable at precisely the moments when the nervous system is most vulnerable. Late at night, in the quiet spaces between tasks, in the moments of ordinary aloneness that are now filled with an infinite scroll of curated achievement. The metrics have changed everything about how we experience identity, followers, engagement, visible markers of status and progress and worth. The result is not just anxiety, though there is that. The result is a particular intensification of the gap between who we present as and who we secretly know ourselves to be. Jung had a word for the public-facing self, the persona, originally from the Latin word for mask. The persona is not false exactly. It is a selection, a face chosen for the stage. But when the distance between the persona and the interior self becomes too wide, something fractures. This is the root. Not necessarily neglect or abuse, though those leave their own distinct marks. Sometimes it is simply the accumulated message of ordinary life. That people like us do not get things like that. That wanting too much is embarrassing. That success belongs to a specific kind of person, and you have evidence, daily, cumulative, personal, that you are not that kind. You absorbed something about ceilings, about your place in the ecosystem. And your psyche, loyal, adaptive, efficient, built its thermostat accordingly. Here is what makes this so difficult to see. The thermostat is invisible precisely because it is so well integrated. The self-concept does not announce itself. It does not send memos. It simply shapes your perceptions. The opportunity that seems slightly out of reach. The relationship that feels slightly too good to be true. The version of yourself you imagine but cannot quite touch and cannot quite explain why. You are not imagining the ceiling. It is real. It is just not made of what you think. Modern work culture amplifies this in its own specific way. The language of productivity and optimization has colonized the vocabulary of selfhood. We talk about ourselves the way engineers talk about systems, in terms of output, efficiency, performance metrics. And so when we fail to perform, when the saboteur appears and derails us, we reach immediately for the language of malfunction. Something in me is broken. Something in me doesn't work. What is wrong with me? The question itself is the problem. Not because you are beyond criticism, but because it begins from the assumption that you are defective rather than defended, that you lack something rather than protect something, that the pattern is random rather than purposeful. And in a culture that measures worth by visible achievement, the invisible machinery of the unconscious becomes very hard to see. We are so busy looking at what we have produced or failed to produce that we never look at what is producing the producing. We never look at the hand behind the hand. There are two voices, not metaphorically, functionally. One is the voice of aspiration, the part of you that has genuinely internalized the desire for something better. The relationship, the career, the version of yourself that operates from wholeness rather than fear. This voice is real. It is not performance. You do actually want those things. There is nothing false about the wanting. And beneath it, or beside it, or threaded through it, is the other voice. Older, quieter, more certain. The voice that has been running continuous background calculations since childhood, measuring the distance between what you want and what it believes you are allowed to have. And when that distance narrows, when your life actually begins to approach the thing you say you want, this voice does not celebrate. It mobilizes. The internal experience of this is not usually dramatic. It rarely announces itself as resistance. More often, it arrives as exhaustion, distraction, a sudden loss of interest in the thing that was motivating you yesterday. An argument with someone you love that seems to emerge from nowhere, gains intensity disproportionate to its cause, and leaves you feeling strangely familiar even in its destruction. You have been here before. You know this particular aftermath. And somewhere beneath the rational explanation you offer for why it happened, there is knowledge you do not want to look at directly. Jung called this the tension of opposites, the authentic desire pulling in one direction, the protective unconscious pulling in another. And caught in that tension is the part of you that is awake enough to see both, but not yet free enough to choose. This is the inner conflict, not between discipline and laziness, not between ambition and comfort, between the self you have built for survival and the self you would be if survival were no longer the primary requirement. The tragedy is not that people sabotage themselves. The tragedy is that the system doing it is trying to love them. It is protecting something it was taught to protect. It is loyal to a version of you that once desperately needed that loyalty. It just doesn't know that version is not the only one. The cost of remaining unconscious to this is not always visible. That is what makes it so durable. If the cost were immediate and obvious, if every act of self-sabotage produced immediate, clear, undeniable suffering, the pattern would be harder to sustain. But the unconscious is efficient. It spreads the cost. It distributes it across years and relationships and opportunities in a way that makes it possible to look at any single moment and construct a plausible external explanation. The timing wasn't right. They weren't the right person. I wasn't ready. Maybe next year. The accumulated cost, though, is enormous. Not just in what was lost, the opportunities not taken, the relationships not sustained, the creative work not made, but in the internal cost, the chronic low-grade experience of living at a slight remove from your own life, the sense that something is being managed rather than lived, the exhaustion of maintaining a persona that is always slightly larger than the interior self feels it deserves to be. And then there is the deepest cost, the existential one, the quiet understanding, which arrives differently for different people and at different ages. That time is not infinite. That the ceiling you keep hitting is not temporary circumstance but pattern. That you have been here before. That you will be here again, unless something changes. Not the circumstances. You. Viktor Frankl observed that the most destructive thing is not suffering but meaningless suffering. Suffering in the service of nothing. Endured without awareness, without purpose, without the sense that something is being learned or transformed. The cost of unconscious self-sabotage is not just the practical losses. It is the experience of suffering that produces nothing, because the mechanism producing it remains invisible, and therefore beyond growth, beyond integration, beyond change. This is not the part where the tone changes, where the music swells and the language shifts toward possibility and overcoming. That would be the wrong thing to offer here. The wrong register entirely. The turning point is quieter than that, almost uncomfortably quiet. It begins with a specific kind of noticing, not the noticing that leads immediately to self-criticism. There I go again. Why do I always? But a different kind. A cooler, more curious noticing. The noticing that pauses before the judgment. That sees the pattern as pattern rather than as verdict. The saboteur loses power, not through force, but through visibility. The moment you can look at the behavior and ask not what is wrong with me, but what is this protecting, and when did it first learn to protect it, something shifts. Not dramatically. The behavior may still occur, but it loses its invisibility. And what loses its invisibility loses much of its authority. This is what awareness actually means in psychological terms, not the motivational poster version. Be present, be mindful, but the clinical, structural reality of it. Awareness moves material from the implicit to the explicit, from the unconscious, where it operates freely, to the conscious, where it can be examined. And what can be examined can be questioned. And what can be questioned is no longer absolute. The old identity, the one the saboteur was built to protect, it was formed in a specific context, for specific reasons, in response to specific conditions. And those conditions no longer exist. The child who built that thermostat is not the one currently living your life. But the thermostat is still running the house. Updating it is not an act of willpower. It is an act of extended, patient, serious attention. Attention to the moments when the system activates, to the specific textures of the situations that trigger the withdrawal, the self-destruction, the inexplicable retreat, to the emotional logic underneath. Because there is logic, there is always logic. It just requires translation. This work is slow. It is not linear. It does not resolve in a realization. It resolves in repetition, in the same situation arriving again, and this time, choosing slightly differently. Not perfectly, slightly, and then again, until the thermostat learns a new setting. The ceiling you keep hitting is not made of circumstance. It is not made of timing, or the wrong relationships, or an economy that wasn't ready for you, or a world that doesn't understand what you have to offer. Those stories are available. They are always available. The mind that wants to maintain its model will find them without effort. The ceiling is made of belief, specifically of self-concept, the accumulated internal answer to the question, how much am I allowed to have? And it sits at precisely the height your unconscious has decided is safe. Not the height you deserve. Not the height you are capable of. The height that does not threaten the identity built long ago in a context you no longer inhabit. To protect the version of you that no longer exists, but that your nervous system has never been formally told to let go. The saboteur is not your enemy. It never was. It was the most devoted thing inside you, doing exactly what it was trained to do, with exactly the resources it was given, on behalf of a self that needed that kind of loyalty when the loyalty was first formed. But you are not that self anymore, or you do not have to be. The question is not whether you are capable of the life you want. The question has never been capability. The question is whether you are willing to do something much harder than work harder, whether you are willing to become unfamiliar to yourself, to sit with the discomfort of exceeding your own internal budget, to let good things be real, to stop reaching for the familiar wreckage just before the finish line. That is not a motivation. That is a confrontation. And it begins Not with a decision, not with a system, not with a better morning routine, but with the moment you look clearly at what you have been doing. And for the first time, do not look away.